A child's sob broke the evening rain. Harold Brinks had spent 23 years perfecting the art of not being noticed, his mop bucket a shield, his silence a carefully constructed fortress against a world that had long stopped asking his name. But when 7-year-old Lila Mason appeared on the school steps, drenched and trembling like a sparrow drowning in storm, something ancient and unbidden stirred beneath his ribs. He wrapped her in his janitor's coat, the fabric smelling of ammonia and decades of erasure, unaware that this single gesture would summon lawyers with briefcases full of his buried past. The janitor helped a lost child in the rain would become the headline that cracked open everything he'd sealed away. What follows is not rescue, but reckoning. The rain came down in sheets that Thursday evening, turning the Cleveland streets into rivers of reflected neon and exhaust. Harold Brinks stood beneath the overhang of Lincoln Elementary's south entrance, his weathered hands gripping the handle of his industrial mop bucket, watching water cascade from gutters clogged with autumn leaves. The school had emptied hours ago, the last teacher's sedan pulling away around 4:30, leaving behind only the fluorescent hum of hallway lights and the particular silence that settles over places built for children once they've gone. Harold had worked these floors for 2 decades, his routine as predictable as the changing seasons. Push the wide dust mop down the corridors at 5, scrub the cafeteria tiles by 6, lock the maintenance closet at 7:15. He moved through the building like a ghost, his presence noted only by the shine he left behind, the faint chemical scent of pine cleaner marking his passage through rooms where decisions were made by people who never learned his last name. But tonight, something disrupted the pattern, a small sound cutting through the drumming rain, a whimper, high and frightened, coming from the concrete steps that led down to the student pickup zone. Harold's first instinct was to ignore it, to finish his rounds and retreat to his basement apartment where a microwave dinner and a black and white television waited with their familiar emptiness. He had learned through years of careful practice that involvement led to complications, that the safest way to move through the world was to remain peripheral, a figure in the background of other people's narratives. But the sound came again, sharper now, unmistakably human and unmistakably young, and something in his chest tightened despite his best efforts to remain detached. He set down his mop bucket with a sigh that felt like surrender, the metal handle clanging against the tile floor with an echo that seemed too loud in the vacant building. His knees protested as he descended the steps, arthritis flaring in the damp cold, each movement a reminder that at 62 his body kept better records than his mind sometimes wished to acknowledge. The rain soaked through his thin workshirt before he'd gone 3 steps, plastering the faded blue fabric against his shoulders. But he continued downward, toward the huddled shape he could now make out pressed against the brick wall beneath the inadequate shelter of the stairwell's underside. She was small, impossibly small, her frame lost inside a school uniform that hung on her like borrowed clothing, the pleated skirt darkened by water to the color of storm clouds. Her hair, which might have been blonde in better circumstances, lay plastered across her face in tangled strands, and her shoulders shook with cold, or fear, or both. Her thin arms wrapped around her knees in a posture of absolute defeat. Harold stopped 2 feet away, uncertain how to announce himself without causing further alarm. His own breathing suddenly audible in his ears beneath the percussion of rain on concrete. The girl's face remained hidden, buried against her knees, but he could see the trembling that ran through her entire body, could hear the gasping quality of her breath that suggested tears had been falling as steadily as the rain itself. He cleared his throat, the sound rough and unpracticed. He sometimes went entire days without speaking to another human being, and when that produced no response, he took another step forward, his shadow falling across her like a question. Still, she didn't look up, and Harold felt something ancient and painful stir in his memory, a sensation he'd spent years trying to drown in routine and deliberate forgetting. The scent of rain-soaked concrete mixed with something else, something that tugged at Harold with unexpected force. The clean soap smell of a child, that particular innocence that exists before the world teaches complexity and compromise. He crouched down, ignoring the protest of his joints, bringing himself to her level in a gesture that felt both foreign and deeply familiar, as though his body remembered something his conscious mind had locked away. His voice, when it finally came, sounded gentler than he'd heard it in years, softened by an impulse he couldn't name and didn't want to examine too closely. He asked her name, then asked if she was lost, then simply told her that the rain was getting worse and she couldn't stay here, that the school would close completely soon, and there would be no one to help if she remained hidden in this darkening corner. The girl's shoulders tensed at his words, her breathing catching in a way that suggested panic rather than comfort, and Harold realized with a sinking feeling that he was failing at something he'd never wanted to attempt in the first place. But then, with agonizing slowness, she lifted her face, and in the dim light filtering down from the school's entrance, he saw eyes that were too large for her face, brown and liquid with fear, studying him with the desperate calculation of a creature deciding whether to run or trust. Her lips trembled as she spoke, the words barely audible above the rain's steady assault on the world around them, telling him that her name was Lila, that she was 7 years old, that her mother was supposed to pick her up but never came. The explanation tumbled out in fragments, each sentence interrupted by hitching breaths that spoke of prolonged crying, of waiting that had stretched from hope to despair over the course of hours. She tried to go back inside, but the doors had locked automatically at 5:30, had tried to walk home but couldn't remember which direction, had finally returned to this spot, because it was where her mother always pulled up in the silver car that smelled like vanilla and leather. Harold listened without interrupting, his heart doing something complicated and unwelcome in his chest, a sensation like ice cracking after a long freeze. He should call someone he knew, the police, child services, someone official who knew protocols and procedures. But his phone was upstairs in his maintenance closet, and the girl was shaking so violently now that her teeth chattered audibly, and the decision made itself before his rational mind could intervene. He shrugged out of his work jacket, the navy blue windbreaker with Lincoln Elementary embroidered in faded yellow thread across the back, and draped it around her shoulders without asking permission, the fabric enormous on her frame, swallowing her like a tent. The jacket smelled of floor polish and industrial cleaner, of decades spent in service to spaces rather than people, and Harold watched as Lila pulled it tighter around herself, with hands so small they seemed incapable of grasping anything as heavy as the fear he saw in her expression. She looked up at him with something that might have been gratitude or might have been simple exhaustion. And in that moment, Harold Brinks, who had successfully avoided meaningful human connection for longer than this child had been alive, felt the carefully constructed walls around his heart develop their first significant crack. The rain continued its assault on the world, washing away the day's accumulated grime, running in rivulets down the school's brick facade, pooling in the low spots of the pavement where tomorrow's children would jump and splash without thought, for the invisible man who kept their hallways clean. But here, in this liminal space between the building and the storm, between the end of his shift and the beginning of something he couldn't yet name, Harold made a choice that would unravel everything he'd spent 2 decades carefully stitching into place. He held out his hand, weathered and calloused, marked by years of hard labor and deliberate anonymity, and waited to see if trust could bridge the distance between a forgotten man and a lost child in the gathering dark. Yiska. Harold led Lila back up the stairs, with his hand hovering protectively near her shoulder, never quite touching, but ready to steady her if she stumbled on steps made treacherous by rain and exhaustion. The school's interior greeted them with fluorescent brightness that seemed harsh after the storm's grey palette, the hallways stretching away in geometric perfection, lockers standing in silent rows like metal sentinels waiting for tomorrow's chaos. His jacket still hung around the girl's shoulders, dragging on the polished floor as she walked, leaving a faint trail of water that Harold would normally have dried immediately. But tonight he let it remain, this small evidence of disruption in his ordered world. They moved through the building's arteries slowly, Lila's sodden shoes squeaking against tile that reflected their images in ghostly distortion, past bulletin boards advertising bake sales and spelling bees, past classroom doors decorated with construction paper autumn leaves that seemed absurdly cheerful given the circumstances. Harold felt acutely aware of how wrong this was, how his entire routine had been shattered by this small intrusion. Yet simultaneously, he couldn't imagine having left her on those steps, couldn't fathom returning to his bucket and mop while she trembled alone in the rain. The contradiction sat uncomfortably in his chest, a tension between the man he'd become and someone he'd been a very long time ago. The maintenance office occupied a converted storage room near the boiler, a space that smelled perpetually of dust and machinery oil, its walls lined with shelves, holding supplies he'd requisitioned and categorized with military precision. Harold guided Lila inside, switching on the overhead bulb that cast everything in its yellow glow, illuminating a metal desk scattered with timesheets and supply orders, a coffee maker encrusted with years of accumulated residue, a calendar from 2019 that he'd never bothered to replace, because the dates didn't matter when every day looked fundamentally the same. He kept a small space heater for the winter months, plugging it in now and positioning it near the desk chair, where he gestured for Lila to sit, watching as she climbed into the worn seat with her feet dangling several inches above the floor. The heater ticked and hummed as it warmed, orange coils beginning to glow, casting dancing shadows across the girl's face that made her look even younger, more vulnerable, more like something that shouldn't exist in Harold's carefully sterile world. He found a towel in his supply cabinet, threadbare but clean, and handed it to her without ceremony, turning away to give her privacy as she dried her face and hair with small, methodical movements that suggested she was trying very hard to be brave. His desk phone sat in its cradle like an accusation, black and heavy, and connected to authorities he'd spent 20 years avoiding in any meaningful capacity. Harold stared at it for a long moment, his hand hovering over the receiver, knowing he should call the police to report a lost child, knowing that was what any responsible adult would do without hesitation. But something stopped him, a reluctance he couldn't quite articulate, a sense that once he made that call, the situation would spiral beyond his control into bureaucratic machinery that ground people into case numbers and incident reports. Lila watched him from the chair, her brown eyes following his movements with an intensity that made him uncomfortable, as though she could see through the layers of deliberate ordinariness he'd wrapped around himself like armor. She'd stopped shaking, the heater's warmth beginning to work its small magic, but her expression remained wary, uncertain, the look of a child who'd learned that adults weren't always reliable, that promises could evaporate like rain on hot pavement. Harold found himself moving to the coffee maker instead, dumping out the ancient grounds and filling it with fresh water, performing the ritual of preparation because it was something concrete he could do, some small gesture of hospitality in this strange circumstance that felt increasingly surreal with each passing moment. While the coffee brewed, filling the small space with its bitter aroma, Harold asked Lila if she knew her mother's phone number, speaking in the same flat tone he used for everything, emotion carefully scrubbed from his voice through years of practice. The girl recited the digits slowly, concentrating hard on each number as though they might escape if she didn't hold them firmly in her mind. and Harold wrote them down on a scrap of paper with a stubby pencil from his desk drawer. He dialed, the rotary mechanism clicking through each number with deliberate slowness, and listened to the ringing that went on and on without answer, eventually giving way to a generic voicemail message that offered no identifying information beyond the number he'd already called. He hung up without leaving a message, uncertain what he would say even if he tried, then dialed again with the same result, the phone ringing into emptiness while Lila watched with hope fading from her expression like light draining from the evening sky. Harold felt frustration building behind his sternum, a sensation he wasn't accustomed to because frustration required caring about outcomes, required emotional investment in situations beyond his immediate control. He tried a third time, then a fourth. Each attempt met with the same hollow ringing, and finally he set the receiver down with more force than necessary, the plastic clattering against its base in the quiet office. Lila's voice, when she spoke, carried a tremor that had nothing to do with cold, telling him that this had happened before, that sometimes her mother forgot, that there were arguments she wasn't supposed to hear but heard anyway through closed doors. Words about money and obligations and people named in legal documents she didn't understand. The information spilled out in that particular way children have of revealing family secrets without understanding their weight, and Harold found himself listening, despite his better judgment, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug he'd poured but couldn't bring himself to drink. She spoke of a big house with too many rooms, of relatives who visited only to argue, of lawyers who came with briefcases and left her mother crying in ways that made Lila hide in closets until the shouting stopped. The narrative emerged in fragments, non-linear and confused, but Harold began to piece together the outline of something complicated, a family with wealth and dysfunction in equal measure, a child caught in the machinery of adult conflicts she couldn't possibly comprehend. He should stop her, should tell her to save these details for the authorities, who would inevitably become involved, but the words kept coming and he kept listening, drawn in, despite himself, by the simple human need to witness another person's pain without judgment or interruption. The office's single window showed full darkness now, the storm still raging beyond the glass, and Harold realized with something like alarm that over an hour had passed since he'd found Lila on the steps, an hour in which the world outside this small room had continued its rotation, while he'd remained suspended in this unexpected moment of connection. His routine lay abandoned, floors unswept, trash uncollected, final security checks incomplete. And the realization should have caused him anxiety, but instead produced only a strange numbness, as though he were watching himself from a distance, observing a version of Harold Brinks who made choices that defied 20 years of carefully maintained patterns. Lila had fallen silent, her energy finally depleted, her small frame curled in the desk chair, with his jacket still draped around her like a tattered cloak. Harold stood and moved to the window, pressing his palm against the cold glass, feeling the vibration of rain against its surface, and wondered what he'd set in motion by refusing to walk away, by allowing himself to become even peripherally involved in another human being's crisis. Beyond his reflection in the dark glass, headlights appeared at the far end of the parking lot, moving slowly through the storm with deliberate purpose, and Harold felt his stomach tighten with an apprehension he couldn't name, a sense that something was approaching that would change everything, that the simple act of kindness he'd extended to a lost child was about to reveal complications he couldn't yet imagine, but somehow already feared. The headlights multiplied, not one vehicle, but three, moving in formation through the rain-swept parking lot with the kind of precision that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. Harold watched from his office window as they approached. Expensive sedans, painted in black, so deep it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, their tires cutting through standing water with barely a splash, moving as though the storm itself deferred to their passage. They parked in a perfect line beneath the entrance overhang, doors opening in unison to reveal figures holding umbrellas that snapped open with military efficiency, protecting occupants dressed in suits that looked tailored and expensive even from this distance. Harold's hand tightened against the window frame, wood grain pressing into his palm, a growing unease settling into his bones like winter cold. These were not parents arriving late for pickup, not frantic relatives responding to a child's distress, but something else entirely, something that moved with the choreographed certainty of people accustomed to authority and immediate compliance. Behind him, Lila stirred in the desk chair, her breathing changing from the near-sleep rhythm it had settled into, some instinct alerting her to the shift in atmosphere even before she could see what approached. Harold turned from the window to find the girl sitting upright, his jacket slipping from her shoulders, her expression transforming from exhaustion to something closer to fear, not the simple worry of a lost child, but a deeper recognition, the look of someone who'd seen these vehicles before and knew what their arrival meant. She didn't speak, didn't ask who had come, merely stared at the closed office door as though it might hold back whatever was approaching through the school's hallways. Harold heard voices now, echoing through the building's empty corridors, male voices that carried the particular cadence of people making statements rather than asking questions. The sound growing closer, with footsteps that seemed too loud against the polished floors he'd cleaned just hours earlier. He should go to them, should meet them in the hallway and explain the situation with the straightforward facts that would make this nothing more than a minor incident quickly resolved. But something kept him motionless, frozen in the amber of this moment, watching Lila's face for cues he didn't fully understand, waiting for the knock that came seconds later, sharp and authoritative. 3 precise raps against the door that felt more like a summons than a request for entry. Harold opened the door to find 3 men standing in the hallway, their suits immaculate despite the journey through the storm, hair still perfectly arranged, expressions neutral in that particular way that suggested extensive practice at revealing nothing. The man in front held an umbrella still dripping water onto the floor, creating a small puddle that Harold noticed with automatic disapproval, even as his attention remained fixed on faces that studied him with unnerving intensity. The speaker introduced himself as Robert Kensington, attorney for the Mason Family Trust, his voice carrying the burnished quality of expensive education and decades of courtroom practice. He indicated his companions with minimal gesture, Michael Torres and Jennifer Shaw, associates from what Harold assumed must be a significant law firm, their names already beginning to blur in his mind beneath the sudden weight of their collective focus. Kensington asked, with perfect courtesy that somehow felt more threatening than aggression, whether this was Harold Brinks, whether he was the maintenance supervisor who'd contacted them regarding Lila Mason, and Harold felt the world tilt slightly because he'd made no such contact, had called no one beyond the unanswered phone number the girl had provided, and the wrongness of the situation crystallized into something sharp and undeniable in his chest. He denied making any call, his voice flat with the careful control of someone accustomed to speaking only when necessary, and watched as the lawyers exchanged glances that communicated volumes in the silent language of professionals accustomed to working in concert. Kensington adjusted his approach without missing a beat, explaining that the school's automated security system had logged an after-hours entry into the maintenance office, that certain protocols had triggered when Lila's name appeared in the evening access logs, that the Mason family maintained comprehensive monitoring of circumstances involving their youngest ward, given recent complications regarding estate management and custody considerations. The explanation flowed smoothly, each word chosen with precision, painting a picture of protective oversight that might have seemed reasonable if not for the speed of their arrival. The number of attorneys dispatched for a simple lost child scenario, the way their eyes kept moving past Harold to assess the office interior with calculating thoroughness. Harold felt exposed in a way he hadn't experienced in decades, as though his carefully maintained anonymity was being stripped away by forces he couldn't see or understand, his small existence suddenly subjected to scrutiny that felt both invasive and inevitable. Lila appeared behind Harold in the doorway, his jacket clutched around her shoulders like armor, her face pale in the hallway's fluorescent glare. The transformation in the lawyers was immediate and striking. Their neutral expressions shifted to something warmer, almost theatrical in its sudden concern. Kensington crouching slightly to bring himself to the girl's eye level with a smile that looked practiced rather than genuine. He spoke to her in tones of forced gentleness, asking if she was all right, whether Mr. Brinks had been kind to her, whether she needed anything before they took her home to safety and familiar surroundings. The questions felt loaded, strategic, and Harold suddenly understood with crystalline clarity that he was being assessed not as a good Samaritan, but as a potential liability, someone who'd intersected with valuable property, because that's what this child represented to these people, he realized with growing disgust. Not a frightened 7-year-old, but an asset requiring protection and proper management. Lila answered in monosyllables. Her earlier willingness to talk evaporated in the presence of these familiar strangers, her small hand reaching out to grasp the hem of Harold's work shirt with fingers that trembled despite the office's warmth. The gesture was small, barely noticeable, but Harold felt its weight like an anchor dropped in deep water, pulling him down into depths he'd avoided for longer than he could remember. Kensington straightened, his smile fading into something more businesslike, and informed Harold that the family was naturally grateful for his assistance in this matter, that his quick thinking and compassion had prevented what could have been a tragedy, that appropriate compensation would be forthcoming as recognition for his service above and beyond normal custodial duties. The words were generous, the tone warm, but underneath ran a current Harold recognized from his years of invisible observation, the language of obligation being created, of debt being established, of control being asserted through the mechanism of gratitude that came with strings attached. The lawyer produced a card from his inner pocket, cream-colored and heavy stock, embossed with contact information for Kensington, Torres and Shaw, attorneys at law, extending it toward Harold with the expectation of acceptance that people like him rarely refused people like them. Harold took the card automatically, his calloused fingers leaving smudges on its pristine surface, and felt the weight of something shifting, some invisible boundary being crossed that he couldn't yet define, but recognized with the instinct of prey, sensing a trap's mechanism beginning to close. Behind him, Lila's grip on his shirt tightened, and in the hallway beyond the lawyer's shoulders, Harold saw his mop bucket still sitting where he'd abandoned it hours ago, mundane and forgotten, marking the spot where his ordinary life had ended, and something far more complicated had begun. The lawyers departed with Lila into the storm's continuing assault, umbrellas forming a protective canopy above her small frame as they guided her toward the waiting sedans with hands that never quite touched, but shepherded nonetheless. Harold watched from the school's entrance, standing in the space where he'd found her hours earlier, observing the careful choreography of her extraction from his temporary care. She looked back once before the car door closed, her face pale against the sedan's dark interior, eyes meeting his across the rain-swept distance with an expression he couldn't read, gratitude or accusation or simple fear, perhaps all three braided together into something more complex than his emotional vocabulary could articulate. Then she was gone, the vehicles pulling away in the same formation they'd arrived, taillights receding into the storm until only darkness and falling rain remained. Harold stood there longer than necessary, water soaking through his shirt in the absence of the jacket that had left with Lila, feeling the cold penetrate his skin while his mind churned through implications he couldn't yet organize into coherent thought. The business card remained clutched in his hand, growing damp, its embossed lettering beginning to blur as moisture compromised the expensive cardstock. And he stared at it as though it might contain answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. The following days passed in a strange fog, Harold moving through his routines with mechanical precision while his thoughts circled obsessively around that Thursday evening's disruption. He mopped the same floors, emptied the same trash bins, locked the same doors at the same times, but the actions felt hollow now. Performances of normalcy that couldn't restore the equilibrium he'd maintained for 2 decades. Teachers passed him in the hallways without acknowledgement, exactly as they always had, but now their obliviousness felt pointed rather than comfortable, highlighting his invisibility in ways that made him conscious of every interaction he didn't have, every conversation that flowed around him as though he were furniture rather than human. The principal's secretary mentioned in passing that there'd been some excitement on Thursday evening, something about a student pickup confusion. Asking if Harold had noticed anything unusual while closing the building, he'd responded with practiced vagueness, offering nothing beyond confirmation that the school had been secured properly, watching her lose interest immediately as the topic proved less dramatic than whatever rumors had reached her desk. But the lie sat uncomfortably in his stomach, a small deception that felt disproportionately significant, as though he'd betrayed something by refusing to claim his part in the story that was circulating in fragmented form through the school's social networks. On Tuesday morning, Harold's supervisor called him into the district maintenance office, a converted classroom that smelled of industrial coffee and bureaucratic inertia. Roger Stemmons sat behind a desk, buried in purchase orders and complaint forms, his considerable bulk spreading across a chair that creaked with every movement, his expression suggesting mild annoyance at having his routine disrupted. He informed Harold without preamble that the district had received a substantial donation from the Mason Family Educational Trust, funds specifically earmarked for facility improvements at Lincoln Elementary, and that the donation had come with a personal letter of commendation for Harold Brinks, praising his dedication and compassionate service to students. Stemmons read portions of the letter aloud with clear bewilderment, stumbling over phrases like exemplary character and outstanding commitment to child welfare, as though the words belonged to a language he'd never encountered before. Harold listened without reaction, his face carefully blank, while something cold expanded in his chest, the understanding that he was being bound to the Mason family through mechanisms that operated beyond his control or comprehension, that the gratitude Kensington had promised was manifesting as obligation disguised as recognition. The donation funded new floor buffers and updated cleaning supplies, equipment Harold had requisitioned for years without success, suddenly approved with remarkable speed. The improvements arrived within days, professional-grade machinery that made his work easier, even as their presence reminded him constantly of their source, each use a small acknowledgement of debt he'd never agreed to incur. His co-workers in the maintenance department treated him differently now, not with warmth exactly, but with a grudging respect previously absent, as though the letter from the Mason Trust had conferred legitimacy he'd previously lacked in their estimation. Harold hated it, hated the attention even in its minimal form, hated the way his carefully constructed anonymity was being eroded by forces he couldn't deflect or ignore. He considered refusing the recognition, returning the equipment, finding some way to sever the connection before it deepened, but recognized the futility even as the impulse formed. Powerful families didn't release their holds easily, and his acceptance had been assumed rather than requested, his compliance built into the system that had orchestrated Lila's rescue and his subsequent elevation from invisibility. The dreams started on the 10th night, erupting from whatever place Harold had buried them decades earlier. He woke in his basement apartment at 3 in the morning, sheets tangled and damp with sweat, fragments of nightmare dissolving even as he tried to grasp their specifics. A child's voice calling through rooms he couldn't quite visualize. Doors that opened onto memories he'd sealed away with deliberate and desperate thoroughness. A sense of failure so profound it felt like physical weight crushing his sternum. Harold sat on the edge of his narrow bed, head in his hands, forcing his breathing to slow while the nightmare's emotional residue gradually receded into manageable numbness. The apartment around him felt smaller than usual, walls pressing inward, the ceiling too low, everything configured wrong, as though he'd woken in a space designed for someone else's life. He'd lived here for 19 years without such disturbances, his sleep as regulated as his waking hours, maintained through careful avoidance of anything that might stir the sediment he'd allowed to settle at the bottom of his consciousness. But Lila's appearance had disturbed that carefully achieved stillness, and now the past was bleeding through in ways he couldn't prevent, mixing with the present in toxic combination. The business card remained on his kitchen counter where he'd left it after that first night, a small rectangle of expensive paper that seemed to radiate significance disproportionate to its size. Harold found himself staring at it while his coffee brewed each morning, Kensington's name embossed in gold lettering that caught light from the single bulb overhead. He told himself daily that he should throw it away, that keeping it represented a connection he didn't want and shouldn't maintain, but each day it remained, accumulating a thin layer of dust that made its continued presence seem less like choice and more like inevitability. On the 15th day after Lila's rescue, Harold picked up the card and dialed the number before his rational mind could intercept the impulse, listening to the professional greeting of a receptionist who transferred him with smooth efficiency. Kensington's voice answered after 2 rings, warm and unsurprised, as though he'd been expecting this call, as though Harold's resistance and eventual surrender had been calculated into some equation the lawyer had solved before their first meeting. The attorney asked how he could be of service, and Harold found himself asking about Lila, whether she was all right, whether the family situation had stabilized, questions that emerged before he could recognize their implications, that he cared, that he remained invested, that the single evening's intersection with another human being had compromised the isolation he'd maintained so successfully for so long. Kensington's response came wrapped in professional courtesy, informing Harold that Lila was adjusting well, receiving appropriate care within the family structure. Her temporary distress on that rainy evening now resolved through proper channels and oversight. The lawyer's tone suggested the matter was closed, handled, filed away in whatever system managed the Mason family's complicated affairs. But then his voice shifted slightly, taking on a quality Harold recognized from years of observing human interaction from his peripheral position. The sound of someone preparing to make an offer, to extend an opportunity that would arrive with conditions attached in ways not immediately obvious. Kensington mentioned that the family had been discussing how best to express their gratitude properly, that the donation to the school had been merely the first gesture in what they hoped would be an ongoing demonstration of appreciation. He explained, with carefully measured words, that the Mason estate maintained extensive holdings requiring oversight, properties, investments, philanthropic ventures, and that one of these holdings included a small apartment building in Cleveland Heights that had recently experienced turnover in its management position. The building superintendent role, Kensington explained with perfect casualness, would provide substantially improved compensation and living conditions compared to Harold's current circumstances, which the family understood through basic background checks were modest at best. Harold listened with growing suspicion, recognizing charity when he heard it, understanding that this offer represented something more complicated than simple generosity. The apartment came with the position, Kensington continued, a two-bedroom unit with natural light and updated amenities, located in a neighborhood where Harold wouldn't need to worry about safety or the sounds of arguments bleeding through thin walls at 3 in the morning. The building housed primarily young professionals and retirees, quiet tenants who paid rent reliably and respected communal spaces. The work would be lighter than his current position, maintaining common areas, coordinating with contractors for repairs beyond his expertise, collecting rent and managing minor tenant issues, all responsibilities that came with regular hours and weekends free from obligation. The salary figure Kensington mentioned exceeded Harold's current earnings by enough that the number felt abstract, impossible, the kind of income he'd stopped imagining decades ago when his life had narrowed to survival rather than aspiration. The offer hung in the air between them, suspended on the phone line like bait floating in water, and Harold felt the hook hidden inside it, even as part of him recognized the genuine improvement this would represent in his material circumstances. He asked the obvious question, why him, why such generosity for a simple act any decent person would have performed, and heard Kensington's pause before responding, that brief silence communicating more than the words that followed. The lawyer spoke of the family's commitment to recognizing exceptional character, to rewarding those who demonstrated values the Masons held central to their legacy, to ensuring that people who'd shown care for their youngest member received appropriate acknowledgement. The explanation sounded rehearsed, a narrative constructed to obscure rather than illuminate true motivations. Harold pushed harder, his discomfort overriding his usual tendency toward passive acceptance, asking directly what the family wanted from him beyond his relocation to their property and his labor maintaining their investment. Another pause, longer this time, and when Kensington spoke again, the warmth had drained slightly from his voice, replaced by the cooler tone of someone conducting business rather than extending favors. He acknowledged that the family hoped Harold might be available for occasional consultations regarding Lila's welfare, that his perspective as someone outside the family's internal dynamics might prove valuable, that his willingness to help when others might have turned away suggested judgment. The Masons trusted in ways they couldn't always trust those closer to their complicated circumstances. The truth emerged in fragments over the following hour as Kensington, apparently deciding Harold deserved some measure of honesty, outlined the Mason family's current situation with the clinical detachment of someone describing a particularly complex legal case. Lila's grandfather, Thomas Mason, had built a fortune in manufacturing and real estate over 5 decades, accumulating wealth that came with the usual complications of inheritance planning and family expectation. His death 2 years earlier had triggered exactly the kind of warfare that substantial estates often produced. Siblings contesting will provisions, second marriages creating step relationships with competing claims, business partners asserting historical agreements that superseded written documents. Lila's mother, Catherine Mason, was Thomas's daughter from his first marriage, a woman who Kensington described with careful neutrality as struggling with the responsibilities of single parenthood while managing estate litigation. The girl's father had never been part of the picture, a detail Kensington glossed over quickly, and Catherine's priorities seemed to oscillate between fierce protection of her daughter's interests and periods of neglect that concerned the attorneys managing the trust funds established for Lila's benefit. The rainy evening when Harold found Lila represented not an isolated incident but a pattern. Catherine missing pickups, forgetting obligations, disappearing into her own crises while her daughter waited in schools and therapy offices and ballet studios for adults who failed to arrive. Harold felt something harden in his chest as he listened, anger mixing with recognition, the story touching places he'd thought he'd successfully cauterized. He understood now why the lawyers had arrived so quickly, why monitoring systems tracked Lila's movements, why a 7-year-old's temporary distress had triggered responses measured in attorneys and sedans, rather than simple phone calls. The girl wasn't just a child, but an asset in ongoing litigation, her welfare weaponized by competing family factions, her needs subordinated to the larger war over Thomas Mason's legacy. And Harold, by his simple act of kindness, had demonstrated qualities the family trust's executors found valuable: someone outside their networks, someone without obvious ulterior motives, someone who'd helped without expectation of reward or recognition. They wanted him positioned where he could serve as eyes and ears, a reliable witness to Catherine's parenting when custody questions inevitably escalated, someone whose working-class credibility might counterbalance accusations of bias from family members with their own attorneys and agendas. The apartment building job was real, the improved circumstances genuine, but they came attached to an expectation that Harold would be available when the lawyers needed testimony about what he'd observed, about Lila's condition when he'd found her, about whether her mother's neglect rose to levels that might justify trust interventions in custody arrangements. Kensington didn't state any of this explicitly, of course, but Harold had spent enough years observing human behavior from his invisible vantage point to read what remained unspoken. The lawyer concluded by giving him 48 hours to consider the offer, to think about whether the improved circumstances outweighed whatever reservations he might have about the family's motivations. The call ended with professional pleasantries that felt hollow, and Harold sat in his basement apartment with the phone still pressed to his ear, listening to the dial tones hum while trying to process what had just been proposed. Part of him wanted to refuse immediately, to reject this attempt to draw him further into the Mason family's dysfunction, to restore his anonymity and the safety it provided. But another part, the part that had been stirring since Lila's small hand had gripped his shirt in his office, recognized that he was already involved, that walking away now wouldn't restore the isolation he'd maintained before that rainy Thursday, that perhaps the universe or fate or simple chance had placed him at an intersection where his choice actually mattered to someone beyond himself. The basement walls pressed close around him, familiar in their shabbiness, and Harold wondered if a person could remain hidden forever, or whether eventually everyone had to step into visibility and accept whatever consequences that exposure brought with it. Harold didn't sleep the night after Kensington's call, lying instead on his narrow bed while memories he'd successfully suppressed for 23 years forced their way through the defenses he'd constructed. The darkness of his basement apartment became a screen against which his past projected itself in fragments. A small bedroom with yellow walls and curtains that filtered afternoon sunlight into gold. A toy truck with one wheel missing that had been a birthday present. A voice calling his name with the particular inflection parents use when pride and love make ordinary words sound sacred. Her name was Emma, and she'd been 4 years old when Harold's first marriage had collapsed under the combined weight of his drinking and his wife Patricia's entirely justified fury at what he'd become. The details returned with cruel clarity, the jobs lost to hangovers, the promises broken with regularity, the gradual erosion of trust, until Patricia had packed their daughter's clothes and left, while Harold was passed out on a Tuesday afternoon, leaving behind only divorce papers and a restraining order that made his proximity to his own child a criminal offense. He'd fought it initially, shown up to court hearings still reeking of the previous night's whiskey, made the kinds of scenes that judges remembered when determining parental fitness. The final ruling had been swift and absolute. Supervised visitation only, contingent on documented sobriety, and Harold had managed exactly 3 such visits before the shame became unbearable and he'd stopped appearing at all. Emma would be 27 now, a woman he wouldn't recognize on the street, living a life he'd forfeited any right to know about when he'd chosen bottles over being present for her childhood. Patricia had remarried within 2 years, and the lawyer handling that case had been efficient and thorough, severing Harold's parental rights with his own signed consent, because the alternative was fighting a battle he knew he deserved to lose. He'd spent the following 3 years in a blur of day labor and blackouts, drifting through Cleveland's margins until rock bottom had arrived in the form of a hospital bed and a doctor explaining that his liver was approaching failure, and his choices now were sobriety or death. He'd chosen sobriety, barely and grudgingly, attending enough AA meetings to establish that he could sustain recovery before abandoning the program's community aspects in favor of isolated maintenance of his newfound stability. The janitor position at Lincoln Elementary had materialized through a workforce re-entry program, and Harold had embraced it with the fervor of someone who recognized it as his last chance at anything resembling functional existence. The work had become his salvation and his punishment simultaneously. Punishment because it kept him in proximity to children whose lives he couldn't touch. Salvation because the routine provided structure that his damaged willpower required to prevent backsliding into old patterns. He'd successfully avoided thinking about Emma for years at a time, constructing his life so that triggers remained minimal and memories stayed buried beneath layers of deliberate forgetting. But Lila had detonated that carefully maintained separation, her small frame and frightened eyes resurrecting every failure Harold had accumulated in his daughter's brief childhood. The protective impulse he'd felt, the inability to walk away and leave her on those rain-soaked steps, had emerged from some part of himself he'd thought he'd successfully killed through neglect and determined isolation. And now Kensington was offering him a chance to be involved, to potentially matter in a child's life again, while simultaneously asking him to serve as instrument in adult warfare that used Lila's welfare as ammunition rather than genuine priority. The parallel was too precise to ignore. Once again, Harold found himself positioned where his presence could either help or harm a child, where his choices would ripple beyond his own small existence into another person's formation, where the easy path of walking away competed with the terrifying possibility of engagement. Morning arrived, without Harold having reached any conclusion. Daylight, filtering through his basement window's small rectangle to illuminate the shabby furniture and water-stained walls that had been adequate when they represented anonymity, but now felt like failure made visible. He called in sick to work for the first time in 8 years, listening to his supervisor's confused acknowledgement before ending the call and sitting in his kitchen with coffee going cold in a chipped mug. The business card still occupied its place on the counter, Kensington's name and number somehow accusatory in the morning light. Harold knew he should refuse the apartment, should tell the lawyers that he wanted no part of their family's dysfunction, should restore the boundaries that had kept him safe from meaningful human connection for longer than some marriages lasted. But he also knew, with the weary certainty of someone who'd run from consequences before and understood their tendency to catch up regardless, that he was going to accept. Not because he wanted the improved circumstances, though those were real enough, and not because he believed he could make any significant difference in Lila's life, though some part of him hoped he might. He was going to accept because walking away now felt like repeating the pattern that had defined his worst years, and because at 62 years old, with more past than future, the prospect of dying without having tried to be better than his history seemed like the only outcome worse than whatever complications acceptance would bring. Harold picked up the phone and dialed before doubt could intercede, listening to the now familiar sound of Kensington's office greeting. The lawyer answered with the same warmth as before, as though he'd known this call was coming, as though Harold's capitulation had been visible from the beginning. Harold accepted the position with minimal discussion, listening to details about move-in dates and building orientation that washed over him like water over stone. Significant, but not fully absorbed. Kensington mentioned almost as an afterthought that Harold would need to complete background checks. Standard procedure for anyone working in property management, nothing to worry about unless there were surprises in his past that might complicate things. Harold felt his stomach clench, thinking of ancient arrests for drunk and disorderly conduct, of the restraining order that might still exist in some database, of the parental rights termination that would appear in any thorough review of his legal history. But he said nothing, simply confirmed he understood the requirements, and let the lawyer continue with instructions about paperwork and timelines that would transform him from invisible janitor to someone whose name appeared on lease agreements and W-2 forms with Mason Properties as employer. The call ended with Kensington's assurance that Harold had made the right decision, that the family looked forward to working with someone of his evident character and reliability. Harold sat with the phone still pressed to his ear long after the line had gone dead, listening to the silence and wondering what exactly he'd just agreed to. What doors he'd opened by accepting this offer disguised as generosity. Outside his basement window, he could see feet passing on the sidewalk above, disembodied legs moving through their days with purposes he couldn't know, lives continuing in their own orbits, while his own trajectory bent towards something he couldn't yet visualize, but felt approaching with the inevitability of weather. He thought of Lila looking back at him from the sedan that night, of Emma, who he'd last seen when she was barely older than Lila was now, of all the ways a person could fail the vulnerable and all the microscopic possibilities that maybe, despite everything, failure wasn't the only available outcome. The apartment around him felt smaller than ever, walls pressing close like the boundaries of the life he'd constructed, and Harold understood that he was about to leave this place that had been adequate precisely because it demanded nothing, offered nothing, promised nothing, beyond the basic shelter that kept him alive and invisible while the world turned, without noticing his continued existence within it. The move happened on a Saturday in late October, Harold's possessions fitting into the back of a borrowed pickup truck with room to spare, his entire life reduced to boxes that could be carried in 3 trips up the stairs to his new second-floor apartment. The building in Cleveland Heights sat on a tree-lined street where autumn leaves gathered in rust and gold drifts, where the houses showed their age through dignified wear rather than abandonment, where the ambient sounds were squirrel chatter and distant lawnmowers rather than sirens and shouted arguments. His new apartment had windows that actually opened, floors that didn't sag, a kitchen with appliances from this century and counter space that invited cooking more ambitious than microwave dinners. Harold moved through the empty rooms, feeling simultaneously grateful and suspicious, unable to fully accept that he deserved this improvement, waiting for the hidden cost to reveal itself with the inevitability he'd learned to expect from anything that seemed too good to be true. But the days passed without demand or crisis, his superintendent duties proving manageable and occasionally even satisfying, the tenants treating him with casual respect that made his previous invisibility seem like a choice he'd made, rather than a condition imposed by others' indifference. 3 weeks after his move, on a Thursday evening that carried the same grey quality as the night he'd found Lila, Harold answered a knock on his door to find her standing in the hallway, with Catherine Mason hovering behind her like an uncertain shadow. Lila wore a school uniform similar to the one she'd been soaked in that first night, her hair pulled back in a ponytail that made her face seem even younger, her expression mixing shyness and recognition in equal measure. Catherine looked exhausted. Expensive clothes hanging on a frame that seemed diminished by stress, her makeup unable to fully conceal the darkened skin beneath her eyes or the tension around her mouth. She introduced herself with the brittle courtesy of someone performing social rituals out of obligation, explaining that Lila had been asking about Harold, that she'd wanted to see where he lived now, that Catherine hoped it wasn't an imposition for them to visit briefly. Harold stepped back to let them enter, his new apartment suddenly feeling too large and too empty, inadequate for receiving guests he'd never expected and didn't know how to accommodate. He offered water because it was all he had, watching as Lila wandered to his living room window to stare out at the street below with intense focus that suggested she was avoiding looking at the adults behind her. Catherine spoke in the rushed cadence of someone with limited time and complicated obligations, thanking Harold again for his help that rainy night, acknowledging that things had been difficult lately with the estate litigation and the emotional toll it was taking on everyone involved. She mentioned almost defensively that Lila saw a therapist now, that they were working on strategies for managing anxiety around separation and abandonment, that missing one pickup didn't define her as a mother, despite what certain family members were claiming in their legal filings. The information emerged in fragments, Catherine's composure cracking around the edges to reveal the person beneath the performance, and Harold found himself feeling unexpected sympathy for this woman, who seemed trapped in circumstances that ground her down, despite her obvious efforts to hold together. She asked if the building superintendent position was working out well, if he'd experienced any problems with the apartment or the tenants, if there was anything the property management company should know about maintenance needs or concerns. The questions felt genuinely interested, rather than perfunctory, but underneath Harold heard the unspoken inquiry, whether he planned to remain, whether the Mason family's investment in his relocation would prove stable, whether he could be counted on for whatever future needs might arise. Lila turned from the window to ask, with the directness that children sometimes achieve, whether Harold had any kids of his own, whether he'd ever been a father, whether he knew how to play the card game her therapist had taught her to help with worry thoughts. The questions landed like stones in still water, ripples spreading outward through the conversation, and Harold felt Catherine's attention sharpen, sensing significance she couldn't yet define. He answered with painful honesty, telling Lila that yes, he'd been a father once, that he'd had a daughter who would be grown up now, that he'd made mistakes that meant he hadn't been part of her life for a very long time. The admission hung in the air, more confession than he'd offered anyone in decades, and he saw understanding dawn in Catherine's expression. Recognition that Harold's willingness to help Lila had emerged from personal history that gave him context for her distress, that his careful maintenance of boundaries afterward had been self-protection rather than indifference. She didn't ask for details, thankfully, but something shifted in how she looked at him, a reassessment that suggested she was seeing him as a person, rather than as a function the family trust had acquired. Lila asked if Harold's daughter ever got to see him now, her voice carrying the particular sadness children experience when they understand loss even without comprehending its full dimensions. Harold told her no, that sometimes people made choices that meant they couldn't undo the distance they'd created, that being absent was sometimes the only way to stop causing harm to people you loved, but weren't good for. The explanation was inadequate, circling around truths too complex for a 7-year-old to hold. But Lila seemed to accept it with the resilience children demonstrated when adults offered them honest engagement rather than dismissive platitudes. She showed him the card game then, a simple matching exercise that involved identifying emotions on illustrated faces and discussing situations that might create those feelings. They played 3 rounds, sitting on Harold's living room floor. Catherine watching from the couch with an expression that cycled through gratitude and grief, and something that looked like hope struggling against long odds. The game was transparently therapeutic, designed to give Lila vocabulary for internal experiences that might otherwise remain overwhelming and inarticulate. And Harold found himself unexpectedly moved by the evidence of Catherine's efforts to address her daughter's needs, despite her own obvious struggles with the family crisis enveloping them both. The visit lasted only 40 minutes before Catherine checked her phone and announced they needed to leave for a dinner obligation. But in that brief window, something had shifted in Harold's isolation. Some small aperture opening in the walls he'd constructed. They left with promises to visit again, if Harold didn't mind, Lila hugging him briefly at the door before following her mother down the stairs, and Harold stood in his apartment's threshold, watching them disappear around the landing below. The building felt different after they'd gone, less like a hiding place, and more like a location where life happened, where people intersected with genuine rather than transactional interest. He returned to his living room to find the emotion cards still scattered on the floor, gathering them carefully and setting them on his kitchen counter near Kensington's business card. These small artifacts of connection, existing in proximity to each other, like evidence of transformation he hadn't sought but couldn't now refuse. Through his window, dusk was settling over Cleveland Heights, streetlights beginning their warm glow against the gathering dark. And Harold stood watching the evening arrive with something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Not happiness exactly, but maybe the faintest possibility of it, the suggestion that a person's story might contain chapters beyond the ones they'd already written. The background check results arrived 2 weeks later, delivered by courier in an envelope marked confidential, and Harold opened it with the fatalistic certainty that his past was about to foreclose whatever future the Mason family had been offering. The report was thorough, chronicling his arrests, his divorce, the termination of parental rights, the documented years of alcoholism and instability that preceded his current 2 decades of sobriety and reliable employment. He read through the clinical summary of his failures with the numb detachment of someone reviewing someone else's history, though the shame that accompanied each paragraph felt immediate and personal, fresh despite the years that separated him from those actions. A handwritten note was clipped to the final page, Kensington's distinctive script informing Harold that the Family Trust's executive committee had reviewed the report and, in consideration of his demonstrated rehabilitation and his documented reliability over the past 20 years, had determined that his past would not disqualify him from the position. The note concluded with a single sentence that Harold read 3 times before its meaning fully registered. Sometimes, second chances are what allow people to become who they were always capable of being. Harold sat with the report for hours, processing the fact that his worst history had been exposed and examined and, against all expectation, had not resulted in rejection. The Mason family knew about Emma now, knew about his failures as a father, knew about the drinking that had destroyed his first attempt at building something decent, and they'd chosen to employ him anyway. The trust felt both liberating and binding. Liberating because the fear of discovery no longer hung over him. Binding because now he understood that the family had made a conscious choice to invest in his rehabilitation, that his continued employment represented their belief that damaged people could be repaired through stable circumstances and meaningful responsibility. He thought of Lila with her emotion cards, of Catherine struggling against the weight of expectations and litigation, of his own daughter Emma somewhere in the world, living a life he'd forfeited claim to, and recognized that the pattern of his past didn't have to determine the shape of what remained ahead. Accepting the Mason family's offer meant accepting that he could be something other than invisible, something other than simply safe in his isolation, something that involved risk and vulnerability and the possibility of mattering to someone beyond himself. That Saturday, Harold did something he hadn't done in 23 years. He went to an AA meeting, finding a group that gathered in a church basement 6 blocks from his new apartment. He sat in the circle of metal folding chairs while people shared their stories of falling and rebuilding, of relapse and recovery, of the daily work required to remain present in lives that would have been easier to abandon. When his turn came, Harold spoke his name aloud for the first time in this context in more than 2 decades, the syllables feeling foreign in his mouth, like a language he'd once been fluent in but had forgotten through disuse. He told them about finding Lila in the rain, about the ways her distress had cracked open his carefully maintained emotional armor, about accepting a job that came with expectations he wasn't certain he could meet, but felt compelled to try. He spoke about Emma without saying her name, about the daughter he'd failed, and the second chance he'd been offered to be present for a different child in a different capacity, about the fear that he'd simply repeat his past failures in new configuration. The room listened without judgment, several people nodding recognition at experiences that paralleled their own. And when Harold finished speaking, the group leader thanked him for his honesty and reminded him that staying sober one day at a time was the only way anyone managed to stay sober at all, that the past was evidence but not prophecy. That change was possible for people willing to do the difficult work of becoming better versions of who they'd been. Harold left the meeting feeling lighter than he had in years, the confession having released pressure he hadn't fully recognized he'd been carrying. He walked back to his apartment through streets growing dark with early winter evening, passing houses with lit windows that revealed families moving through their routines, and felt for the first time that he might belong to this world rather than simply existing on its margins. His phone rang as he climbed his building's front steps, Lila's number appearing on the screen that Catherine had programmed during their visit, and he answered to hear the girl's voice asking if he might have time to play the emotion card game again tomorrow, that her mother said it was okay to call, but only if Harold wanted to and didn't feel bothered by it. Harold assured her he'd like that very much, that tomorrow afternoon would work perfectly, that she should bring her cards, and maybe they could make hot chocolate since the weather was getting cold. The call lasted less than 3 minutes, ending with Lila's small voice saying goodbye with careful politeness before the line went quiet. But Harold stood in his building's entrance for several moments afterward, holding the phone and feeling something he hadn't experienced in longer than he could accurately remember. Anticipation for tomorrow. Genuine interest in a future beyond simply surviving until it arrived. The rain returned that night, gentle and steady rather than storm-violent, washing the city clean in the darkness, while Harold lay in his apartment listening to its rhythm against his windows. He thought of that first Thursday evening when everything had changed, when he'd found a frightened child and made the choice to step out of his invisible safety into complicated engagement with another person's pain. The decision had cost him the isolation that had protected him, had exposed his past to scrutiny he'd avoided for decades, had drawn him into a family's dysfunction where his role remained uncertain and potentially compromising. But it had also given him this apartment with windows that opened, had connected him to people who saw him as someone capable of growth rather than simply fixed in his failures, had offered the possibility that his remaining years might contain meaning beyond the simple maintenance of sobriety and routine. Harold understood that he'd been given something precious and terrifying, a chance to matter, to be present, to potentially make different choices than the ones that had defined his worst years. The responsibility felt heavy, the risk of failure real and close. But lying in the darkness, listening to rain speak its steady language against glass, Harold realized that he was willing to carry that weight, willing to accept the vulnerability that came with allowing himself to care about outcomes beyond his own immediate survival. The janitor who'd helped a lost child in the rain had become someone else through that simple act. Not transformed completely, not suddenly redeemed, but perhaps incrementally moved toward the kind of person who stayed present even when staying was difficult, who showed up even when showing up required courage he wasn't certain he possessed. And in the gentle percussion of rainwater, finding its way to earth through darkness, Harold heard something that might have been approval, or might have been simply the world, continuing its indifferent cycle, but either way sounded like permission to try.